Hello, everyone. Assalamu alaikum to you. All peace and blessings be upon all of you watching today. So, this is the second video of my series, Basics of Islam Part 2. And in this video, we're going to talk about how the number 19 is a fundamental and basic aspect of Islam. Many people don't know about it, but it is actually very true. And let's get right into it. This is going to be a quite long presentation, so grab your coffee, grab your snacks, grab your refreshments, and just enjoy the show and hope you get a lot of value out of this. So the Quran states that the number 19 will one day serve five functions. One function will be that it will be a trial for the disbelievers. It will also bring certainty to the people of the book, which means Jews and Christians. It will increase the faith of the believers. It will remove the doubts from the hearts of the people of the book and the believers. And it will cause the disbelievers to ask, what did God mean by this example? So the Quran lists these five specific functions of number 19. And we will see how the number 19 serves these five functions. As you can see here, this is where the prophecy of 19 is mentioned in the Quran. Verse 74:30 says, over it are 19. And then the next verse after it, 74:31, says, we have made not but angels as custodians of the fire. And we have not assigned iddatahum, which means their number, or the number 19, except as, and then you see the five specific functions. Trial for disbelievers, helping the people of the book attain certainty, increasing the faith of the believers, removing the doubts from the believers and the people of the book, and so that people who have sickness in their hearts and the disbelievers, they ask, what did God really mean by this example? So we see here the number 19 will serve these five functions one day. And that means the number 19 will one day prove and confirm beyond a doubt that the Quran is true and that Islam is the correct religion, because nothing else would remove the doubts and increase the certainty of Jews and Christians except for except for if Islam was proven to them as the truth beyond all doubts. So how will the number 19 fulfill the Quranic prophecy? How will the number 19 prove that Islam is the correct religion and that the Quran is the truth? How will the number 19 convince Jews and Christians that Islam is correct, and which will cause them to convert because they will realize it will cause them to convert and have faith because they will realize that Islam is the correct religion? How will the number 19 fulfill this prophecy? So back in 1974, it was actually discovered that not only is the entire Quran mathematically composed based on the number 19, but this mathematical composition is so vast and complex that even adding a single verse anywhere will cause dozens of disruptions to its mathematical composition. So there's this whole structure based on the number 19. There's lots of mathematical calculations involving qualities and aspects of the Quran. Uh, and each of those calculations produces multiples of 19. There's so many multiples of 19 throughout the entire Quran. And this whole mathematical structure involves surah numbers, number of verses, geometric values, Quranic initials, and a lot more qualities of the Quran itself, even some special words. The number 19 is mathematically present throughout the entire Quran in many, many different ways. It's very complex. It's a very complex structure, a very complex mathematical structure based on the number 19. So this this 19 base structure actually contextualizes the Quran's challenge to humanity. Because it's well known that the Quran says, oh, if you doubt that the Quran came from God, if you believe that the Prophet Muhammad fabricated the Quran and made it up, then make a Quran like it. This is the Quran's challenge, and the Quran says that that people will never be able to do something like that. So lots of people were like, okay, well, if the challenge is based on literary quality, then I can make a Quran with as high of a literary excellence as the Quran itself. Or I can make a book with with a literary excellence that's as high as the Quran itself, or even better than the Quran. Like the author Taha Hussein, she believed that she made a book that's better than the Quran or just as good as the Quran in terms of literary quality. And Ani Shorosh, he made a book called A True Furqan, which he believes is better than the Quran in terms of literary quality. But in my opinion, the challenge of could not be about literary quality because that's a subjective metric. Because what defines a good book? That's very subjective. Like maybe some people like Harry Potter and other people do not. To some people, Harry Potter is very good literature, to others, it's not. So if the challenge is about literary quality, then it's subjective because the qualities of literature that one person may like and appreciate very much, another person may not appreciate in the same way. But the Quran's 19 base structure provides some meat or substance or objectivity to this challenge because let's say you were to pick a random number, like maybe 7, 8, 9, 21, or 13, whatever. Pick one random number and use that number to make any book you want. And that book must be mathematically composed based on that number. But here's the catch. You must mathematically you must mathematically structure your book without even trying, no intention. Should not try at all. You should not have any knowledge about it at all. So you must unintentionally create a mathematical structure based on the number that you chose. Like if you chose the number 7, you must unintentionally make a book that is mathematically structured based on the number 7 without even trying to do it. So no computers, no calculators, no intention, nothing. And as a bonus, you could try to find a way to predict your book's mathematical composition. Like you can create like some sort of prophecy of 7 inside your book, but without even trying to do it. Like the reason why is because Prophet Muhammad was not aware of any information about the number 19. He had no knowledge about this at all. Yet the Quran is mathematically structured based on the number 19. So if you want to make a book like the Quran or even better than the Quran, then you better be able to make a mathematically structured book without even trying to do it, which is impossible. Because maybe you can gather all the best mathematicians in the world and make a book that may even rival or surpass the Quran's mathematical structure. Maybe that's possible, but you need intention to do it. You need to be able to try to do it or put some effort into doing that. You can't unintentionally do that. It's like putting, it's like, let's say you have a clock, but it's broken up into parts, and you just throw all these parts together randomly, and then, and then that just sticks all the parts together in in the proper spots to make a functioning clock. You can't do that. Let's say you have a bunch of pages, and then you randomly throw all these pages together, and then it makes a and then it's structured into a complete perfect tower. You can't do that. Let's say you have a bunch of blocks and then you just throw them in the ground in this and then pile them together like with one throwing motion. You just throw it at the ground randomly and then it just makes a nice big tall tower. You can't do that. You need intention to do all of these things. Likewise, it would be impossible to unintentionally make a mathematically structured book. So this is the challenge. If you could do it, then good luck. But the probability that you'll be able to do it is probably zero. Very, 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 very small, if any, if any. So why the number 19? One possible reason is that the number 19 is a prime number, and we know that prime numbers are divisible only by one and itself. So it may be that 19 being a prime number in that way symbolizes the oneness or of God or symbolizes monotheism. And interestingly, the number 19 is the geometrical value of the number 1 in all scriptural languages, such as Hebrew, Arabic, and Aramaic. So in Arabic, the number 1 is wahid, which I think the wa it's composed of four letters: wa, alif, ha, and dal. And all four letters have a geometric value, and their geometric values add up to 19. And what is a geometric value? Well, it's like Roman numerals because before the current number system, the Arabic letters themselves were assigned numbers. And that's the number system that they use to make calculations and to count things. It's like the letter X in Roman numerals it represents the number 10. Likewise, the letters that compose of the Arabic word wahid, which means one, have the individual geometric values of these four letters add up to number 19. And this is the same in Aramaic, and this is the same in Hebrew. And another possible reason why the number 19 was chosen is because the number 19 is 1 and 9. It's the first and last non-zero number. And this represents God's attribute in the Quran as the first and the last. So these are possible reasons why the number 19 was chosen. And we see that the Surah Fatiha, that's the first surah of the Quran. And when we examine its structure, we find that the number 19 is written all over it. Like, for example, these facts over here, the first one, when you combine or not add the surah number, which is 1, the number of verses inside that surah, which is 7, because the Quran is divided up into surahs. These are the chapters of the Quran, and each surah contains some number of verses. So surah number 1, number of verses 7, the number of words in this surah 29, 1, 7, 29. That's multiple of 19. And then 1 plus 7 plus 2 plus 9 is also 19 when you add up the digits. Then combining the surah number, which is 1, and the GV, or the geometric value of the entire surah. And remember, the geometric value is the number assigned to each letter, like Roman numerals, because back then they used their letters as numbers. They assigned numerical values to those letters. And this was known as the abjad system. So the geometric value of the entire surah, which is 10,143, combined with the surah number, which is 1. So 1, 10,043. That's 19 times 5797. When you combine the surah number, which is 1, number of verses, which is 7, the number of letters in this surah, which is 139, the geometric value or GV of the entire surah, which is 10,143. When you combine these numbers, you get a multiple of 19. Combining the surah number, which is 1, the number of every verse in the surah, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. When you combine them together, you get 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That is a multiple of 19. Combining the surah number, which is 1, the number of letters in every verse, which is 19. No, the number of letters in each individual verse. So, like, the first verse has 19 letters. The second verse has 17 letters. Third verse has 12 letters. Fourth verse has 11 letters, and so on. That would give you a multiple of 19 when you combine those numbers together in sequential order. And then there's more facts. I'm not going to go over all of them individually. You can just pause the video and see this for yourself. Okay, I'm moving on. I hope you pause the video. I hope you pause the video. Oh, I like this one. When you combine the surah number, which is 1, the number of verses in the surah, which is 7, the first verse number, the number of letters in the first verse, the individual GV or geometric value of every single letter in the first verse, and then you repeat this data for verse 2. So the number of the second verse, which is 2, the number of letters in the second verse, which is 17, the individual GV of every letter in the second verse, and you do the same for verse 3, verse 4, so on until all 7 verses. And then all these numbers are combined in sequential order. The resulting 274-digit number is a multiple of 19. And you combine surah number 1, the number of the first verse, which is verse 1, the number of words in the first verse, which is 4, 1, 1, 4, 19, or 19 times 6. And then here are some additional facts. I hope you pause the video because I'm not individually going over them. Okay, and I'm moving on. So the Quran's Bismillah there's also a mathematical structure to it based on the number 19. And the Bismillah is a phrase in the Quran which means in the name of God, the gracious, the merciful. And some interesting facts about this phrase is that it is verse 1 of the first surah, which is Al-Fatiha, and it is verse 0 in all other surahs because it doesn't have a number assigned to it. It's a prefix for all other surahs. Like Surah 2, for example, before its first verse, there is a Bismillah, Rahmanir Rahim, to prefix it. It comes before each surah. What's interesting about it is that the Bismillah is entirely absent from Surah 9. It is neither a numbered verse or a prefix. And we call all prefixes verse 0, by the way, because if a verse does not have a number, then it would be assigned the number 0 because the number 0 means the absence of any number. It's like the color black. The color black exists because it is the absence of all colors. It's kind of like that. But there is no Bismillah as a verse 0 or verse 1 in Surah 9. It is completely absent. But there is an extra Bismillah in Surah 27, verse 30. So it's an interesting setup. And we have to ask ourselves, why would that be the case? Well, in the Quran, God states that He is the one in charge of its compilation. So He obviously told the Prophet Muhammad what to do with these Bismillah. He told the Prophet Muhammad that it would be verse 1 of Surah Al-Fatiha, or the first surah, and it would not have a number in all the other surahs, and then obviously God told the Prophet to remove it from Surah 9 entirely. Do not include a Bismillah entirely in Surah 9. And obviously God told the Prophet to include another extra Bismillah in Surah 27, verse 30. So from 75:19, we know that the instructions for how to collect and compile the Quran was given from God to the Prophet. And now, due to the Quran's 19-based system, we know that the arrangement of the Bismillahs was done intentionally as part of the design. So, like we already saw that the Bismillah is actually verse 1 of Surah 1. And if that wasn't the case, then all these facts would be invalidated. Just to show you one example. Because if the Bismillah was verse 0 instead of verse 1, then all these would be invalidated. So the following research, like from here on out, this research was derived from Rashad Khalifa. He was the one who first discovered the Quran's 19-based mathematical system. So there are 19 surahs from the missing Bismillah in Surah 9 to the extra one that is found in Surah 27. The extra Bismillah is found in Surah 27, verse 30, and these two numbers make 57, which is a multiple of 19. And let's add up all the surah numbers from Surah 9, the one with the missing Bismillah, and Surah 27, the one which is the one with the extra Bismillah. So we add up all the numbers, 9 plus 10 plus 11 plus 12, all the way to 27. And we get the number 342, which is 19 times 18. When we combine the surah numbers and the verse numbers where each Bismillah occurs, then you add the combinations. The result is a multiple of 19. So, for example, Surah 1 has the Bismillah at verse 1. So its combination is 1, 1. Surah 2 has the Bismillah at verse 0. So its combination would be 2, 0. We don't include Surah 9 because its Bismillah is missing entirely. And then Surah 27 is done twice because there's an extra Bismillah. So you have 27, 0 because Bismillah is a verse 0 at Surah 27. And we also have 27:30 because the Bismillah exists at verse 30 of Surah 27. And then we do this for all the surahs of the Quran. And then you add up all these individual combinations. So you add up 1, 1, 2, 0, 3, 0, 4, 0, 5, 0. You add them all together. The result is 68,191. And this is a multiple of 19. If you do this with only the even numbers, and this means if you do this with only the even numbered surahs, like if you do this with Surah 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, if you do that, the result is also a multiple of 19. But if you do this with only odd numbers, the result is 33,060, which is also a multiple of 19. And there are some other facts, such as the number of verses containing the word Allah or God from the missing Bismillah to the extra Bismillah is 513. And then just note that from here on out, the unnumbered verses or the verse zeros will be excluded from calculations unless explicitly mentioned. So for calculations involving the Quranic verses, unless explicitly mentioned, it would not include the unnumbered verses, which is the case for the vast majority of the calculations. So for here, the Quran contains 6,234 verses and 112 unnumbered or verse zero Bismillahs. Then that makes 6,346 total Quranic verses when you count the unnumbered ones. And that is a multiple of 19. And 6 plus 3 plus 4 plus 6 is a multiple of 19, it turns out. Surah 9, where there is a missing Bismillah, is an odd numbered surah with an odd number of verses. And then when you add the digits of the surah numbers and the digits of the number of verses of the odd numbered surahs with the odd numbered verses from the missing Bismillah to the extra Bismillah. So this may be a little complicated, but for example, Surah 11 has 123 verses. So you add 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 2 plus 3. And then you do the same for the rest. Like Surah 13 has 43 verses, so you add 1 plus 3 plus 4 plus 3. And then Surah 17 has 111 verses, so you add 1 plus 7 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1, and then so on. So the grand total when you do all of that is 114 or 19 times 6. And here's a big one. If the number of every surah is followed by the last digit of each verse number in each surah, And this is done with all surahs ranging from the missing Bismillah of Surah 9 to the extra one found in verse 2730. The resulting 1988 digit number is a multiple of 19. So when you add the last digit of each verse number, so like you do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then when you get to verse 10, you just add the number 0. And then verse 11, you just add the number 1 because that's the last digit of those verse numbers. And verse 12, you add the last digit of those verse numbers, which is 2. And then verse 13, you add the last digit of that verse number, which is 3. And for verse 14, the last digit of that verse number, which is 4, and so on. And you do this for all the surahs from Surah 9 to Surah to verse 2730. And the resulting, and then this big number is 1988 digits, and it's a multiple of 19, as you see over here. Okay, so here's this one. The total number of Quranic verses from the missing Bismillah to the extra Bismillah added to the sum of their verse numbers gives a multiple of 19, 119,624. And if you add that number to the sum of the surah numbers from the missing Bismillah to the extra one, you get a multiple of 19, 119,966. So the total number of Quranic verses, so which is over here, the total number of verses in this table is over here. And then the sum of the verse numbers, so like 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4, the sum of all these verse numbers added to the total number of verses. That's going to give you a multiple of 19, which is 119624. And then when you further add that to the number 342, which is the sum of the surah numbers, you would get a multiple of 19 as well, which is 119966. So it's very, very cool. And there are 4 words in the Bismillah. They are Bism, Allah, Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim. The word Ism, we're not going to use the word Bism because I'll explain why later, but for now we're going to use the word Ism, and that occurs 19 times in the Quran. The word Allah occurs 2,698 times. The word Ar-Rahman occurs 57 times. The word Ar-Rahim occurs 114 times. And these are a multiple of 19 each. So in the Bismillah, this is a key phrase. Each word occurs in the Quran as a multiple. Uh, the amount of times that each word occurs in the Quran is a multiple of 19. And when you add the factors together, because you see over here 142, 3, 6, and then 19 is obviously 19 times 1. So when you add all these factors together, you get 152, which is 19 times 8. And the 4 words, which means Ism, Allah, Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, they occur in 1919 Quranic verses, or 19 times 101. And they also occur in 88 different Quranic surahs altogether. So if you add 1919 plus 88, and then you add it to the GV of the Bismillah, which is 786, the result is 2,793, which is 19 times 147. So here's where I explain why we use the word bism instead of the word ism. I mean, why we use the word ism for the calculation instead of the word bism. But before I get to that part, here's another one. If you combine the surah and the verse number of each occurrence of the word ism without repeating the surah number, if there are multiple occurrences in the same surah, the result is you get this big number over here, which is a multiple of 19. And the word bism, we use the word ism because the word bism is an unusual spelling, and that unusual spelling confers its own mathematical properties, separate from the word ism. So the word bism, the unusual spelling of the word ism, occurs in verse 1:1, verse 11:41, and verse 27:30. If we add the number of occurrences, which is 3, plus the surah numbers and the verse numbers, so 3 plus 1 plus 11 plus 41 plus 27 plus 30, we get the number 114, which is 19 times 6. So 3 plus these numbers, the surah and verse numbers of these three verses, we get 114. And also, the word bism mathematically divides up the Quran because the number of verses from the first unusual spelling to the second unusual spelling of the word ism, which is bism. So the number of verses from the first bism to the second bism is 1,520. The number of verses from the second bism to the third bism is a multiple of 19, which is 1,691. The number of verses from the third bism to the end of the Quran is a multiple of 19 as well, which is 3,135. And this calculation involves the unnumbered bismillahs. So the word bism mathematically divides up the Quran into three sections, and each section un contains a number of verses that are a multiple of 19. There are 30 unique whole numbers that are mentioned in the Quran. And here are all the numbers, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and so on. If we add all these numbers together, the result is a multiple of 19. It is 162,146. And this is very interesting because a couple of times the Quran uses some weird way to say certain numbers. Like the Quran says that the Prophet Noah lived 950 years. But instead of saying the number 950, it said 1,000 years minus 50 years. So why not just say 950? And another example is verse 1825, which says that the people of the cave were sleeping in the cave for 300 years and added 9. Why not just say 309 years? Well, these two verses, verse 29:14 and verse 18:25, are the only places in the Quran where two two of the 30 numbers appear. So verse 29:14 is the only place where the number 50 appears. Verse 18:25 is the only place where the number 300 appears, nowhere else. So you can imagine that if the number 50 was replaced with 950, and if the number 300 was replaced with 309, then the result would not at all be a multiple of 19. Like I said over here, this would cause the sum of the Quranic numbers to be this number over here, which is not a multiple of 19. So you can see proof that the Quran is deliberately adjusting certain words and phrases just to just to make a multiple of 19 because there's no other explanation for this other than to adjust the to adjust the wording of the numbers, to adjust the way you phrase the numbers based on to allow it to fit into the 19 based mathematical structure. This is a this is one sign of that, in my opinion. And the word Allah is a special word in the Quran. There are mathematical properties based on the number 19 involved with it. And this word occurs 2,698 times, which is 19 times 142, which we already know. The sum of the verse numbers where the word Allah is found. Like verse 1, verse whatever in the Quran, when you add the verse numbers of the verses where the word Allah is found, the result that you get is 118,123. And that is a multiple of 19. The sum of all occurrences of the word Allah in all verses whose numbers are a multiple of 19. So like verse 19, verse 38, verse 57, all those verses. The sum of all the occurrences of the word Allah, the number of times it occurs is 133. and that is 19 times 7. The sum of all occurrences of the word Allah in the verses whose numbers are not a multiple of 19 is obviously a multiple of 19, 117,990. And this plus that would give you this number over here, by the way. There are 85 surahs altogether where the word Allah occurs. When the number of all 85 surahs are added, plus the number of verses from the first verse to the last verse that Allah occurs, the result altogether is 8,170. And add the surah numbers and verse numbers of all instances where the word Quran in all of its grammatical forms appear. The result is 4,408, which is 19 times 232. These two verses were excluded because these refer to another Quran. And this one was also excluded because it refers to a non-Arabic Quran, which is another Quran. So the number of instances where the word Quran appears when it refers to the the real Quran is a multiple of 19, as you see over here. And then if we add the numbers assigned to all surahs, plus the numbers assigned to all verses, plus the number of verses in the Quran, the total is a multiple of 19, a double multiple of 19 actually, as you see over here, 346,199. That is a double multiple of 19. If we look at the surahs containing letters known as Quranic initials separately, the Quranic initials are a group of letters that don't spell anything, but they're in the beginning of some surahs, like the letters Alif Lam Mim. That is a Quranic initial. That is the first verse of Surah number 2. And the letters Alif Lam Mim in Arabic do not spell any known word. It's like it's like when you have a when you have like a piece of like a chapter of a book or something, and then the first verse or first sentence of that book is just the letters like X, G, W. And they don't spell any known English word. So what does that mean? It's the same concept over here. The letters Alif Lam Mim, for example, that is one Quranic initial. And it's in the first verse of some surahs like surah number 2, surah number 3, and it doesn't spell any known Arabic word. And the Quran's 19-based structure shows that the Quranic initials play a key role in the Quran's overall structure. Without those initials, a lot of the structure, the Quran's mathematical structure based on the number 19, it will just totally fall apart. And this is one example of that. If you look at the surahs containing Quranic initials separately and add the surah numbers, the numbers assigned to the verses and the number of verses, the total is 190,133. So it's like this calculation over here, but focusing only on the surahs that contain a Quranic initial. And as a result, if this number is a multiple of 19, then this calculation for the uninitialed surahs, the surahs that do not contain a Quranic initial, is also a multiple of 19. And this is a bombshell revelation. Obviously, there actually are two false verses in the Quran because these two verses, Surah 9, verse 128 and 129, they violate a lot of calculations involving the number 19. So it turns out that any calculation of the Quran's 19 base structure that involves the number of verses in Surah 9, when you include these two verses, it gets invalidated. Like any calculation that involves the total number of verses of Surah 9. And you recall that I placed some gold stars earlier, like here there's two gold stars, here there's three, and so on, because the gold stars represent which calculations would be violated if these two verses, 9:128 and 9:129, were included. And I placed 20 gold stars, so these were 20 violations of the Quran's 19-based structure. And I'm going to show you over here 50 more additional violations to the Quran's mathematical structure caused by these two verses, 9:128 and 9:129, which we will see right now. So what does this mean? Why would there be two false verses if the Quran was guaranteed preservation? Well, this just shows us that the preservation of the Quran means that God will insert inside the Quran a security system to help the future generations filter out any false additions or anything that does not appear to belong in the Quran. Because the security system is the number 19 and it will detect all falsehoods and then help us filter out those falsehoods. And we'll see that that the Quran's 19-based system is so complex that even just the addition or deletion of just one verse would cause a ripple effect leading to dozens of violations of the 19-based system. And I just want to add over here, just to clarify that all calculation, I'm going to put this in the center, involving the number of verses of Surah 9 are invalidated if we include verses 9:128 and 9:129 in those calculations. So there's like 6 dozen calculations involving the number of verses in Surah 9, and those calculations would all be violated if we include these two false verses. So this is the Quran's own way of showing us that Surah 9 really has 127 verses instead of 129 verses. Just so that we are clear on this. So the total occurrence of the word Allah from the beginning of the Quran to the end of Surah 9 is a multiple of 19, only if we exclude the two false verses. Surah 9 is an uninitialed surah, and the number of verses where the word Allah occurs is a multiple of 19, which is 1045, if we exclude these two verses. And here's where we're going to get into big numbers. So you write the number of verses for each surah, followed by the verse numbers for each surah. So, for example, Surah 1 has 7 verses, so you write it as 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Surah 2 has 286 verses, so you write it as 286, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all the way to 286, and so on. And you put all these numbers side by side in sequential order. When you do that, you get a 12,692 digit number that is a multiple of 19. And the number 12,692 itself is also a multiple of 19. And all of this would be invalidated if we include these two false verses, as we will see over here. You can see this big number is 12,692 digits, and this big number is confirmed to be a multiple of 19. When this number 12,692 is also a multiple of 19. 19 times 668. And then when you write the number of verses for each surah, followed by the verse numbers for each surah, we already did this, but let's switch it up this time and then write the number of verses at the end of the verse numbers. So we did 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 over here. Instead of doing that, you just do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 7, and you do the same for the other surahs, s- and then you add 6,234, which is the number of Quranic verses at the end. This is the number of the Quranic verses that have a number. We don't include the verse zeros in this one. This makes a 12,696 digit number, and that is a multiple of 19. You can see here the math adds up with this calculator, and we are good to go. Let us write out the all of the verse numbers in each surah, followed by the sum of the verse numbers. So Surah 1 verse numbers are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The sum of and the sum of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, when you add them all together, is 28. So the combination for Surah 1 is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 28. The combination for Surah 2 is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 286, 41041, because the sum of all these verse numbers over here from 1 to 286 is 41041. And then you rinse and repeat essentially for each surah, and then put all the numbers side by side like this. And you're going to get a big 12,836 digit number, which is a multiple of 19. And this would not happen if you include these two verses over here, the two false verses. If you include them, you would not get a multiple of 19. And this time, if you reverse the order and put the sum of the verse numbers for first. So instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 28, like we did over here, we do 28, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and you do this for all surahs. And this 12,836 digit number would still be a multiple of 19, and neither would be the case if we include the two false verses. And then you repeat slide 232, but instead of going from the first surah to the last surah, you go all the way back from the last surah to the first surah. So we're doing over here like Surah 1 has 7 verses, and the sum is 28. Surah 2 all the way to the end of the Quran. So we went from the beginning of the Quran to the end. But here we are repeating the same calculation, but you start from the end of the Quran and you go all the way back to the beginning. And if you do that, you see over here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 28. This is the combination for the first surah, which is Surah 1, and this is at the end. So you go from last all the way to first. And this 12,836 digit number is a multiple of 19 if we don't include the two false verses. And then you write the total sum of the Quranic verse numbers, which is 333410, and the sum of the numbered verses, which is 6,234, and the total number of surahs, followed by the surah number and the number of verses of each surah. So we do like over here, we do 333410, 6234, 114. And then we start at Surah 1, which has 7 verses, so you write 1 and 7. Surah 2 has 286 verses, so you write 2, 286. 3, 200, 4, 176, 5, 120, 6, 165, 7, 205, 8, I forgot how many verses Surah 8 has. Surah 9, 127. We don't say 129. We don't include the two false verses. And we keep on going. This 474 digit number is a multiple of 19, this big 474 digit number, which would obviously be invalidated if we include the two false verses. Okay, so we're repeating the same calculation here, but instead of 1 7, you write 7 1. Instead of 2 286, you write 286 2. So we're essentially reversing the order of the surah number and the verse number. For the first calculation, we did the surah number first, followed by the number of verses. But here in the second calculation, we're going to reverse the order. So here is going to be the verse number followed, the number of verses followed by the surah number. So 7 1, 286 2, 203, 176 4, and so on. And once again, the result is a multiple of 19 if we do not include the false verses. Okay, now let's put side by side the sum of the verse numbers of each surah. And at the end, put the sum of all the verse numbers. So Surah 1, the sum of its verse numbers, so like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, the sum of its verse numbers is 28. So we write 28. The sum of Surah 2's verse numbers is 41041, so we write 41041. For Surah 3, the sum of its verse numbers is 20,100, and so on until the end of the Quran, and then we write the number 333140 at the end, because that is the total sum of all the verse numbers of the Quran. And this makes a 377 digit number that is a multiple of 19 if we do not include the false verses. Let's write down each verse number of each surah, followed by the sum of the surah number and the total number of verses. So Surah 1 has 7 verses, and the sum of the surah number and the number of verses is 8. So 1 plus 7 is 8. So Surah 1's combination is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. For Surah 2, when you add the surah number and number of verses, we get 2 plus 286, and that is 288. So we write 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all the way to 286, and then we put 288 at the end. And we do this for every surah, like Surah 3, we write 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all the way to number 200. That is the end of Surah 3. And then in the end, we put 203, because 200 plus 3, the surah number plus the number of verses makes 203. So we would add 203 at the end. And we do this for all surahs and then put each number put each combination side by side in order. And this will make a 12,774 digit number that is a multiple of 19 if we do not include verses 9, 128 and 9, 129. And we can just check the work over here real quickly. Yes, it all adds up. All right, it is well known that the Bismillah acts as verse 0 in 112 surahs, verse 1 of Surah 1, and totally missing from Surah 9. And there's an extra Bismillah in Surah 27, verse 30. So now this big number is going to include the verse zeros for the first time. So you write down the surah number followed by the number of verses, followed by each verse number. But this time you include a 0 for all Bismillahs that serve as a verse 0. So Surah 1 obviously has no verse 0. So we just do 1, 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So surah number, number of verses, and then each individual verse number. Surah 2, the surah number is 2, the number of verses is 286, and it has a verse 0 Bismillah before all its verses. So we add a number 0 over here. And then we include the individual verse numbers over here. So 2, 286, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, so on. In Surah 9, the Bismillah is missing entirely, and it has 127 verses. So we do, so we write 9, 127. We don't include a 0 because the Bismillah from Surah 9 is missing entirely. It's not there. So unlike Surah 2, which has a verse 0 Bismillah, Surah 9 does not have that, so we do not include the 0. So we just do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all the way to number 127. And we do this for all surahs until the end of the Quran, and you put all the numbers side by side. And you're going to get a 13,038 digit number. That is a multiple of 19 if we exclude verses 9, 128 and 9, 129. And if you think this is incredible, this is the work for this calculation. But if you think this is incredible, here's an even better one. If you write the surah numbers followed by the number of verses in that surah, followed by the sequential number of each verse of the Quran. So what does that mean? For Surah 1, you write the surah number, which is 1, and then for verse 1, you write the verse number, which is 1, and then the sequential number, which is 1. The sequential number is the order of the verse as it appears relative to the Quran. So Surah 1, verse 1, that is the first verse of the Quran. And then verse 2, that is the second verse of the entire Quran. So you write 2, 2. Verse 3 of Surah 1, that is the third verse of the entire Quran. And so its sequential value, its sequential number is 3. So you write 3, 3, 4, 4, 5, 5, 6, 6, 7, 7, and so on. For Surah 2, you write the number 2, which is the Surah number. And then verse 0, because this is the verse 0, Bismillah. And then the number 8, because this is the eighth overall verse of the Quran. Because Surah 1 had 7 verses. So after its 7 verses, you get the verse 0, Bismillah. And that is verse 8. And that is the eighth verse that occurs in the Quran. And then verse 1 of Surah 2, that is the ninth verse that occurs in the Quran. So you write 1 and 9. Verse 2 of Surah 2, that is the 10th overall verse of the Quran. So you write 2, 10. Verse 2 of Surah 3, that is the 11th verse that is the 11th verse that occurs in the Quran. So you write 3, 11, 4, 12, 5, 15, 6, 16, 7, 17, 8, 18, 9, 19, so on all the way to 286. And verse 286 of Surah 2 is the 294th verse in the Quran. So you write 294 after it. And we do this for all surahs of the Quran. And we should note that Surah 9 does not have a Bismillah, so we do not write a verse 0 for it. And then we put all these combinations, these numerical combinations, we put them all side by side. And this would give a big 37,088 digit number that is a multiple of 19. And the number 37,088 itself is a multiple of 19. It is 19 times 1952. And all of this here would be invalidated if we include verses 9, 128 and 9, 129. So if we include the two false verses, this giant calculation over here would not would be invalidated. It would not be true. It would not give any multiples of 19. And then here's just some additional calculations. I'm not going to go through all of them because it will take way too long. I'm just gonna go one by one, and then I want you to pause the video to see this for yourself. So starting from here, then here, Actually, I like this one. When you write the sum of the surah numbers, the sum of the verse numbers, and the sum of the number of total verses from the missing Bismillah to the extra Bismillah at at 2730. So you exclude this verse. The total would be 119966. And then if this calculation was done from the missing Bismillah to the verse where the number 19 is explained, then the total would be 207,670. So for the first calculation, we see like we write the sum of the surah numbers, the sum of the verse numbers, and the sum of the number of total verses. So what that would mean is like the sum of the surah numbers would be like these surah numbers over here from the missing Bismillah to the extra. So from 9 to 27. So 9 plus 10 plus 11, that would be, I think, 342. And then the sum of the verse numbers, that would be all like 127 plus 109, all the verse numbers corresponding to the surahs from the missing Bismillah to the extra. And then, no, 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 the sum of the verse numbers would be like the sum of the individual verses, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and so on. And then the sum of the number of total verses, that would be 127 plus 109 plus all the number of total verses corresponding to the surahs from the missing Bismillah to the extra one. And then that total would be 119966. But if this same calculation was done from the missing Bismillah to the verse where the number 19 is explained, then the total would be a multiple of 19, which is very interesting. And both calculations would not be valid if these two verses were excluded. And sorry, I was just trying to remember this calculation. That's why I was pausing and stuttering a lot here. Sorry about that. I'm myself trying to understand it, even though I made this presentation. Funny me, am I? Okay, I'm gonna keep going. I'll keep going over here. You see, it went on, but by now you should already know any calculation of the Quran's 19 based mathematical system that involves how many verses are in Surah 9. If if those calculations would all be invalidated if we include the two false verses. So this proves beyond a doubt that these two verses do not belong in the Quran. And there are hadith reports that also provide contradictory that 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 are contradictory about where these two verses came from. So meaning they contradict one another. Like according to Muslim number 1618, Bukhari number 4364, the last complete surah, and complete surah meaning it was revealed together all at once, was Surah 9, as you can see here. The last surah which was revealed in full was Bara'ah, which means Surah 9. It's another name for Surah 9. And the last surah, or part, which means part of a surah that was revealed, was the last verses of Surah Nisa, which is the fourth surah. So the last complete surah, which means revealed all at once. So the last full surah is Surah 9. And that is problematic because If that was the case, why would verses 9, 128, and 129 be Meccan verses, but the rest of the surah be Medinan verses? Because that is the consensus, that these two verses were revealed in Mecca, and then the rest of the 127 verses were revealed in Medina. But but if that were true, that would indicate that Surah 9 was a partially revealed surah. It was not a completely revealed surah. And another red flag is that the Quran was widely memorized by the time the Prophet died, but somehow Zayd ibn Thabit, which is a scribe of the Prophet, he was a important scribe of the Prophet. He was he was a memorizer of the Quran, and he also wrote down the Quran. He also helped compile the Quran into written form. He was unable to find these two verses with any other person besides Khuzaimah ibn Thabit. And then this is despite making all attempts to search for the entire Quran in the hearts of people. Like we see over here, we see that we see that Zaid started searching for the Quran till until he found the last two verses of Surah 9 with Huzaima, and he could not find these verses with anyone else other than him. So he looked everywhere, but he could not find it with anyone except Huzaima. Then you see over here that Zaid started compiling the Quran by collecting it from leafless stalks of date palm trees, and from pieces of leather and hides, and from stones, and from the chests of men who have memorized the Quran. So he looked everywhere in the Quran, including people who memorized the Quran, but he was only able to find the last two verses of Surah 9 from Khuzaimah ibn Thabit. He was not able to find it with anyone else. And as a result of that, he added it to the rest of the Quran. And this hadith over here says that Huzaima ibn Thabit, he was also the only one who found Surah. He was the only one who had remembered Surah 33, verse 23. But this hadith is different from the other two because in this hadith, Zaid was Zaid said that he used to hear Surah 33, verse 23. He used to hear this verse from the Prophet, but he could not find it with anyone except Huzaima ibn Thabit. But in this case, Zaid was one who had prior knowledge of verse 33:23. But those hadith z- does not indicate that Zaid had prior knowledge of these two verses, 9:128 and 9:129. And we know that if we delete this verse 33:23, if we delete it from the Quran, it would cause many, many disruptions, dozens of disruptions to the Quran's 19 base structure. But if we delete verses 9:128 and 9:129 from the Quran, then it would restore the Quran's mathematical structure. That is the main difference between these two verses. And here's some other hadith that raises red flags because this comes from the book Al-Itqan by the scholar Al-Suyuti. In this hadith, it says that Ubay ibn Ka'b, not Huzaima ibn Thabit. It was Ubay ibn Ka'b who knew of the verses 9:128 and 9:129. And this hadith said that everyone else believed that Surah 9 had 127 verses. Because it says over here, they thought, because when they reached verse 9, 127, they thought this was the last of what had been revealed. But then out of nowhere, Ubay said that God's messenger, peace and blessings be upon him, had me recite two verses after this. So Ubay out of nowhere introduced the two false verses when everyone else thought that verse 9, that that verse 127 was the end of Surah 9. Everyone else thought it was the end, but he introduced these verses out of nowhere. And then this hadith over here says that it was not Huzaima who had these two verses. It was actually his son who had it. And then it says Al-Harith ibn Huzaima bought two verses from the end of Surah Bara. And then and then here are and then what it said over here is the two false verses. And then Umar ibn al-Khattab asked, "Who was with you in this?" And then Al-Harith replied that, "I only know that I bear witness that I heard them from God's messenger." And then out of nowhere, for some reason, Omar said, "I bear witness that I heard them from God's messenger." So if you bear witness that you hear them from the prophet, then why would you not know where they belong? Because Umar said, if it was three verses, I would make them a separate surah. And then they looked for a surah from the Quran and attached them to it. Thus, it was attached at the end of Bara, which is Surah 9. So if Umar and if Al-Harith are two witnesses for these two verses, then if they bared witness that they heard it from the Prophet, then why in the world would they not know where these two verses belonged? And also, what authority do they have? Like, if it were three verses, what authority would they have to make it a separate surah? Because the Quran said that only God is responsible for the collection or compilation of the Quran. So only God gets to assign verses to the Quran wherever he wants to. So what authority does Umar and anyone else have to make it a separate surah if it were three verses? That is a contradiction with the Quran. So this hadith raises some red flags as well. And then this hadith says that it's essentially the same thing, but instead of being Umar saying that I bear witness that I heard it from the Prophet, it's Usman who makes this claim. And then when Usman says, I bear witness that they are from God after hearing it from Huzaima, then why would he ask, so where do you think you should put them? Because if Usman and if Huzaima were the two witnesses for these two verses, why would they be confused of where these two verses should belong? Why would Usman say, I bear witness that they are from God, yet at the same time he asks, so where do you think you should put them? If you bear witness they are from God, shouldn't you know where they belong? So this is another hadith from, and this hadith comes from Ibn Abi Dawud. And this is another hadith that is a red flag. It it shows red flag signs for these two verses, 9:120 and 9:129. And then now we reach the part about the Quranic initials. Like I said, imagine you have a poem and its first verse is just the letters X, G, B, or whatever combination. Obviously, the letters X, G, B do not spell any known English word. And it's the same for the Quranic initials. These initials are either the first verse of a surah or they're included in the first verse of a surah. So there are 29 surahs with a Quranic initial. 15 of them, in 15 of them, those Quranic initials are standalone in the first verse. Like Surah 2, the first verse is just the letters Alif Lam Mim. Surah 3, the first verse is just the letters Alif Lam Mim. In Surah 36, the first verse is just the letters Ya and the letters Sin. In Yeah, so in 15 surahs, the Quranic initials are standalone as first verses. And the rest of the surahs, I think the 14 other surahs, It's part of it's in the beginning of the first verse, and then there's like a sentence after it, like we see over here. Surah 68, it says Noon, and then this is a Quranic initial, it's a letter, and then a sentence after it. Then in Surah 7, no, this is Surah 7 is a standalone, it's a verse that contains a standalone Quranic initial. So these four letters, Alif, Lam, Mim, Swad, these four letters are the entire verse 1 of Surah 7. Then Surah 12, let's see. In Surah 12, the initials Alif, Lam, Ra, it's in the first verse, and then after those initials is a sentence. So yes, there's a difference between standalone Quranic initials and Quranic initials that are followed by a sentence after it. And Surah 42, it's a unique surah because its first two verses are standalone Quranic initials. So you see over here, the first verse is just the letters Ha and the letters Mim. So this is a Quranic initial, Ha, Mim. And the second verse of the surah is another Quranic initial. It's the Arabic letters Ain, Sin, and Qaf. So this is the only surah where two verses have standalone Quranic initials. And we're going to see why this is very significant for the Quran's 19 base structure. Because the Quranic initials had nobody knew what they meant. It was previously believed that only God knew what they meant. Not even the Prophet had any idea what these letters meant or their significance. But we now know that the Quranic initials are very important to the Quran's 19 base system. If um if these initials did not exist, then there would be many dozens of violations. Like I want to show you again Surah 42. We see in Surah 42 that these two letters, Ha and Mim, are a standalone Quranic initial. These are verse 1 of Surah 42. And these three letters are just verse 2 of Surah 42. Why not just why not just put these five letters in one Quranic verse? Why separate them into two Quranic verses? Because we see in Surah 19, Surah 19, the Quranic initial is Kaf, Ha, Ya, Ain, Swad, so five Arabic letters. This is one Quranic initial consisting of five Arabic letters in one verse. This surah did not put Kaf and Ha in one verse and then Ya, Ain, Swad in a second verse, like Surah 42. You just put all those five letters in one verse. So why do that for here, but in Surah 42, divide them, divide those five letters into two standalone Quranic initials in two verses? Why do that? And why do one thing for one surah, but another thing for another surah? It seems very arbitrary, right? Well, it turns out if Surah 42 followed the same pattern as Surah 19, and its first verse was just Ha Mim Ain Sin Qaf. If its first verse was just that, then there would be dozens of violations to the Quran's 19 base system. Like I said over here, Surah 42 followed the pattern of Surah 19. There would be at least 3 dozen violations of the Quran's 19 base structure. So in many ways, in my view, the Quranic initials serve to complete the Quran's 19 base structure. It's like the icing on a cake or the cherry on top of the ice cream. or even like the toppings, like or the toppings on a pizza. It's kind of like that. And here are some simple facts involving the Quranic initials. There are 29 surahs with Quranic initials occurring and inclusive of Surah 2 and Surah 68. There are 19 alternating sets of initialed and non-initialed surahs within this group. So like Surah 2 and Surah 3 are initialed surahs. This is one set. Then Surah 4, Surah 5, Surah 6. This is these surahs are not initialed surahs. So this is another set. This is a set of non-initial surahs. And then Surah 7 is an initial surah. So this is another set. Then Surah 8, Surah 9, these are uninitialed surahs. So that is another set of non-initial surahs. Then Surah 10, Surah 11, Surah 12, Surah 13, and so on. And Surah 14, Surah 15, that is one big set of initial surahs. So from Surah 2 to Surah 68, from the first Quranic initial to the final one, there are 19 alternating sets of initialed and non-initialed surahs. And the total number of verses from Surah 2 verse 1 to Surah 68 verse 1 is 5,263, which is a multiple of 19. And intermixed between Surah 2 and Surah 68 are 38 or 19 times 2 non-initialed surahs. The cumulative value of all initialed surahs is 15,675. So CV, or cumulative value, is like when you have a number, you add it to the sum of all previous numbers. So like the number 7, the CV of the number 7 would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5 plus 6 plus 7, and that would result in the number 28. So the CV for number 7 is 28. So the CV for all initial surahs, like Surah 3, for example, its CV is 6 because 3 plus 2 plus 1 is 6. When you add all those CVs together, or cumulative values, you would get a multiple of 19. And the word Allah occurs 2,641 times between verse verse 2:1 and verse 68:1, because verse 2:1 is the first verse with a Quranic initial, and 68:1 is the final verse with a Quranic initial. So when you exclude the two false verses, the word Allah occurs in a multiple of 19. The frequency of the word Allah is a multiple of 19 between these two verses. And obviously that means it occurs 57 or 19 times 3 times outside verses verse 2:1 and 68:1. And if we add the surah and verse numbers of the 57 occurrences of the word Allah outside the initial section, we find the total is 2,432, which is 19 times 128. There are 14 different Arabic letters making 14 different combination of Quranic initials. 14 plus 14 plus 29 is 57, which is 19 times 3. And then some more facts would be like when you add the surah number of a surah that contains a Quranic initial with the number of verses in that surah and the amount of initial verses and the GV of the Quranic initial that is in the surah. And you repeat this for all surahs containing a Quranic initial. So for example, Surah 2 has one verse that contains a Quranic initial, and it also has 286 verses. And the GV of its initial, Alif Lam Mim, is 71. So you add 2 plus 286 plus 1 plus 71, and that gives you 360. So you repeat this for all surahs that contain a Quranic initial, and the grand total that you would get is 7,030, and that is a multiple of 19. And if you switch it up and instead multiply the surah number with the verse number. So we added 2 plus 286 over here. Instead of doing that, you just do 2 times 286. And then when you do that for all the initial surahs, the result is a multiple of 19, as you see over here. And then note that for Surah 2, it would be 42 times 53 plus 2 plus 278 because it has two verses that act as standalone initials. So Surah 2 has only one verse. That's why you add plus 1 over here. In one verse, it contains a Quranic initial. But Surah 2, in two verses, there is a Quranic initial. So you add plus 2 instead of plus 1 for this calculation and also for this calculation over here, for both calculations. And there are 14 Arabic letters that make the Quranic initials. If you add the GV of each of those Arabic letters with the number of the very first surah in which that letter appears in a Quranic initial. So, for example, Alif is one of the letters in the Quranic initial. The very first initial in which it appears in the Quran is Surah 2 as the initial Alif Lam Mim. And the GV of Alif is 1, so we're adding 2 plus 1, and you do this for all 14 letters. So, like Alif is 1, and then Lam is another, so you add the GV of Lam with the first with the number of the first surah which it appears is, meaning Surah 2, and you do this for the initials, and the total is 988, which is 19 times 52. So like I'm trying to figure out how to explain this in a more easier way. So let's say we have the letter Meme the letter Meme that is one of the 14 Arabic letters in the Quranic initials, and the geometric value, the GV of the letter Meme, plus the number of the very first surah in which the letter Meme appears as a Quranic initial, which is Surah 2. And then we do this for all 14 letters. And you're going to get a grand total of 988, which is a multiple of 19. And it turns out that within the initial surahs themselves, their composite letters occur in those surahs in various multiples of 19. So for example, Surah Yasin is the initial for Surah 36, and the letters Ya and Sin occur in Surah 36, a total of 285 times, which is 19 times 15. Surah 42 has Ain Sin Qaf as a Quranic initial in the second verse, and the amount of times that the letters Ain Sin and Qaf occur in this surah is 209, which is 19 times 11. The initial Kaf, Ha, Ya, Ain, Sad occurs in Surah 19, and those individual letters occur 798 times in this surah, which is a multiple of 19. And the initial Qaf occurs in Surah 50, and the amount of letters Qaf in this surah is 57, 7, which is 19 times 3. And we should also note that in Surah 42, the letter Qaf also occurs 57 times, which is 19 times 3. And surprisingly, Surah 42 has 53 verses, and 42 plus 53 is 95. And Surah 50 has 45 verses, and 50 plus 45 is also 95, which is 19 times 5. So, so it's the Quran's 19-page structure manifests itself in unique ways like this. And this is probably my favorite one because the initial Hamim, this is found in 7 consecutive surahs, 40, 41, 42, 43, all the way to number 46. The total occurrence of letters Ha and Mim in these 7 surahs is 2,147 times, which is a multiple of 19. And this is where it gets a little complicated because the frequency of the letters Ha and Mim in Surah 40 is 380 and 64 respectively. In Surah 41, it's 276 and 48 respectively. In Surah 42, it is 353 respectively. And when you add up all these frequencies, you get a multiple of 19, which is 19 times 51, and 19 times 59. Not only that, but if you add the digits of all the frequencies, so like 3 plus 8 plus 0 plus 6 plus 4 plus 2 plus 7 plus 6 plus 4 plus 8, and so on. If you add up all the digits that make up the frequencies, you're going to get the number 59, and that corresponds to the 19 times 59 that we see here for the frequencies. And we do the same calculation for Surah 43, 44, 45, and 46. This will give a total frequency of Ha and Mim as 1026, and that is a multiple of 19, 19 times 54. And when you add the digits of the frequencies, like the individual digits that make up the frequencies, you get a total of 54. That corresponds to 19 times 54. You do the same calculation for 41, 42, and 43. You get a total frequency of Ha and Mim as 10,045, or 19 times 55. And adding the digits of those frequencies will give the number 55. This is the multiplication factor for 19 times 55. And lastly, if you do the same calculation for Surah 40, 44, 45, and 46, it'll give a total frequency of Ha and Mim as 1,102, and that is 19 times 58. And you add the digits of the frequencies of Ha and Mim in those surahs, you're going to get the number 58. So this shows how complex and intricate the Quran's 19-based mathematical structure can actually get. And of course, Alif Lam Mim, Alif Lam Ra, as per the most updated count in 2002, according to the study, you can verify the method by going to this link over here. The total count of Alif Lam Mim in all the surahs that are initial Alif Lam Mim is this number over here. And then Alif Lam Ra is another initial. The total count of the letters in those surahs that are initial with Alif Lam Ra is 9,481, which is a multiple of 19. Same thing for Alif Lam Mim Swad. This is the most updated count. You can verify the updated count over here and the methodology that they used to obtain this result. And it is a multiple of 19 for the initial Alif Lam Mim Ra and the initial Alif Lam Mim Swad. And the Quranic initial Swad is unique because its multiple of 19 forms with interlocking relationship between surahs that contain different initials. So like Surah 38 is the only surah initialed with the letter Swad alone. Surah 7 is initialed with Alif, Lam, Mim, and Swad. And Surah 19 is initialed with Kaf, Ha, Ya, Ain, Swad. And the amount of the letters Swad that appear in those three surahs is a multiple of 19, which is 152. So this multiple of 19 is derived with an interlocking relationship between three surahs. And this is another example of an interlocking relationship because Surah 20 has the Quranic initial Taha. Surah 26 and 28 has the Quranic initial Ta, Sin, and Mim. And Surah 27 has the Quranic initial Ta and Sin. Altogether, the frequency of those letters in these surahs is 1,592, which is not a multiple of 19. But if you add the Ha from Surah 19, and Surah 19 is initialed as Kaf, Ha, Ya, Ain, and Swad. If you add the letter Ha, the count of the letter Ha in Surah 19, the result is a multiple of 19, 1,767. So this is a more complicated interlocking relationship than this one. So why would there be a complicated setup? We don't know, but the in the Quran it stated many times that that God likes to diversify his signs, or nusarrif in Arabic. In some verses, in some verses, it says كَذَلِكَ نُصَرِّفُ الْآيَاتِ. So this is how we diversify the signs. لَعَلَّكُمْ تَذَكَّرُونَ, so that you may remember. So the Quran's 19 base structure is diverse, and God likes to maybe make it diverse. So instead of simple relationships like in these initials, uh, the initials over here are grouped together with an interlocking relationship. And the Quranic initial Noon is found in Surah 68 only. And the total occurrences of the letter Noon in this surah is 133, or 19 times 7. And this Quranic initial is unique because it is commonly thought that the letter Noon is a standalone letter in Surah 68. But actually, the letter Noon is spelled out in the Quran as Noon Wow Noon. It's like when you spell out the letter D with the letters D, E, E, rather than simply writing out the letter D. And most people, like when you go over here, Surah 68, most people write it as just a single letter rather than spelling it out because the copies of the Quran that we have today are based mainly on the oral transmission, or what was recited from generation to generation. And when you recite the letter Noon, whether it's spelled out as Noon Wow Noon or written down as just the letter Noon, when you recite this letter, it sounds the same either way. It's like when you write down the letter D and when you write down the letters D, E, and E. When you recite them, they both sound exactly the same. So if the Quran the written copies of the Quran today are based on oral transmissions, it would of course make sense for people to not know that the letter Noon is actually spelled out as Noon Wow Noon because they sound exactly the same. There would be no way to know the difference. But there exists verified Quranic precedent because the Quran itself elsewhere does spell out the letter Noon as Noon Wow Noon. You can see here the prophet Jonah, or Yunus in Arabic. One of his titles in the Quran is Dhannun. You see over here, Dhannun. So what does Dhannun mean? Many scholars believe the term Dhannun means person of the fish because Noon Wow Noon, because you see over here, Noon Wow Noon, Dhannun. When you spell out the letter Noon as Noon Wow Noon, it does not make any known Arabic word. And the prophet Jonah is known for being swallowed by the fish or the whale or whatever animal he was swallowed by. So because of this, because he was known for being swallowed by the fish, many scholars assume the that the that the word that the letters nun wow nun refer to fish. They assume that the term nun means person of the fish because of that. But it's not known exactly what nun means. It's not known what Noon Wow Noon refers to exactly. And it cannot be, and this cannot be a correct interpretation because the prophet Jonah is called companion of the fish in Surah 68. And in Arabic, this is Sahib al-Hut. So if the word fish in the Quran is Hut, then it's very unlikely for an obscure word noon to mean fish as well. The most straightforward explanation that makes as little assumption as possible is that the Nun means person who has the letter Nun in his name or possessor of the letter Nun. because the letter Nun, all we know is that, I mean, because Nun Wow Nun, all we know is that these three letters spell out the letter Nun. But we cannot conclude for sure that Nun Wow Nun creates a word that means fish or whale or anything like that. So this is Quranic precedent that that the letter Nun is spelled out as Nun Wow Nun because the Prophet Yunus in his Arabic name has the letter Nun. That's why he is called possessor of the letter Nun or person of the letter Nun. And other mathematical proofs here. Let's take each of the 14 initials and add the number of occurrences in the initial surahs and add the sum of the surah numbers where the initials occurs. So like for example, the initial alif occurs in the beginning of 13 surahs. When we add up all their numbers, it makes 209. If you add 209 with 13, which is the number of occurrences of the initial alif, you would get the number 222. And you do this for all 14 Quranic initials, like Alif Lam Mim, Yasin, even the Quranic initial Nun. And this result would be a multiple of 19, 2033. And this result depends on the initial Nun occurring twice in verse 68:1, when spelled out as Nun, Wow, Nun. And some more calculations over here. Let's add the surah number where the initials occur plus the number of letters in each initial with repetition, plus the number of verses that contain a Quranic initial. So for instance, Surah 2 and Surah 3 are initialed with Alif Lam Mim. We can add 2 plus 3 plus 3, which is and 3 is the number of Quranic initials for Surah 2. I mean, wait, I explained it wrong, I think. I mean, we add 2 because that corresponds to Surah 2. 3, this corresponds to Surah 3. 3, the number of Quranic initials for Surah 2. 3, the number of Quranic initials for Surah 3. 1, the number of verses containing a Quranic initial for Surah 2. And 1, the number of verses containing a Quranic initial for Surah 3. So we're adding the surah numbers where the initials occur, plus the number of letters in each initial, plus the number of verses that contain the Quranic initial. So we're adding, for Surah 2, we add 2 plus the number of letters in each initial. So 3 for Surah 2, plus the number of verses that contain the Quranic initial, 1 for Surah 2. So 2 plus 3 plus 1 is the combination for Surah 2. And then 3 plus 3 plus 1 is the combination for Surah 3. And we do this for all the Quranic initials. So the result is a multiple of 19, which is 931. If we were to switch it up and multiply instead of adding the surah numbers with the number of Quranic initials that they contain and add the products, then add the total number of verses that contain a Quranic initial, we get a multiple of 19. So for Surah 2, instead of adding 2 plus 3, we multiply 2 plus 3 because Surah 2 contains 3 Quranic initials, Alif, Lam, Mim. And then add the total number of verses that contain a Quranic initial. So 1. So 2 times 3 plus 1. And then we repeat this combination for all the initial surahs, and then we add them together, we get a multiple of 19. And both calculations depend on it depends on Surah 68, verse 1, spelling out the letter Nun as Nun Wow Nun. In this way, this allows this surah to contain 2 Quranic initials, 2 letter Nuns, rather than just one. And for those calculations, we only focus on the letter Nun. We don't focus on the letter Wow because The initial is not noon, wow, noon. The initial is just one initial noon spelled out with three letters. So the actual initial is noon. So when doing the calculations, we focus on the letter noon, not the letter wow. And for this one, let's add the sum of the numbers of the surahs and the verses where the Quranic initials are found, the frequency of occurrence of all the letters in every initial in the surah that they occur, the number of the first surah where the initial occurs, and the number of the last surah where each initial occurs. So the letter alif is a Quranic initial, and it occurs in verses 2:1, 3:1, 7:1, and so on. And we add the number of times the letter alif occurs in those surahs. And then you do this for each of the 14 Quranic initials. And when you do this, you get a grand total of 44,232, which is a multiple of 19. And this calculation depends on the letter Nun occurring 133 times in Surah 68, due to it being spelled as Nun, Wow, Nun. So the Quran's mathematical structure confirms that the Quranic initial should not be written as a standalone letter Nun. This should be spelled out as Nun, Wow, Nun. So in conclusion, there is a prophecy of 19 in the Quran, which states that the number 19 will one day increase the faith and certainty of the believers and the people of the book and remove the doubts from their hearts. It will remove the doubts that the Quran, it will remove doubts about how authentic and true the Quran is and how correct Islam is as the true religion. It will remove any doubts about that. It will convince people beyond all doubts one day that the Quran is the truth and that Islam is the correct religion. And the Quran's 19-based mathematical structure fulfills this possibility because there's no way that the Prophet Muhammad could have unintentionally created such a complex structure. Like, for example, the challenge. You pick a random number and then make a mathematically composed book based on that number, and you do so unintentionally, without any intention whatsoever. It's very impossible to do. And also, it's important to note that there are a couple of prophecies in the Quran that are more well known than this, like the prophecy of the smoke, the prophecy of the splitting of the moon, the prophecy of Gog and Magog. Those are end time prophecies, and they're well known and spoken about in the Quran by people, but nobody knows about the prophecy of number 19. So that's really quite a strange phenomenon. It's there in the Quran in clear wording that the number 19 will one day prove beyond all doubts, that prove Islam as the truth beyond all doubts, but nobody knows about this and nobody talks about this. So the number 19, it's been established thoroughly that the number 19 is a basic foundation of Islam. And it explains many things about the Quran, like why the Quran was revealed out of order, why the Bismillahs have such an odd arrangement, like we talked about. Why do some unusual spellings exist in the Quran? Like in the Bismillah, the word Bism is an unusual spelling because in all other occurrences of the word Bism, it's spelled as Ba Alif Sin Lam. But in the Bismillahs itself, it is spelled as just Ba Sin Mim. It is missing the extra alif. And as we saw, that confers many properties based on the number 19, many mathematical properties. Because if the Bismillah was spelled out the usual way, then there would be a lot of violations to the Quran's 19-based system. If it if it contained the extra alif, like if you go all the way back to the mathematical composition of Surah 1, all of that would be violated. All 16 facts that I presented in the beginning would be violated if you include the extra alif in the Bismillah. So obviously we know that because God is responsible for the compilation of the Quran, Obviously, God told the Prophet to spell out the Bismillah in such an unusual way. And the 19 base system explains why Quranic initials exist, why the strange wordings exist, like the 1,000 years minus 50 years, or the 3,000 years plus 9 years. Why not just say 950 years? Why not just say 309 years? And we now know why that is the case. And it explains how the Quran will be preserved and purified, how Islam will one day be made apparent or manifested as the true religion. Because there is a prophecy in the Quran saying that God will one day make make it obvious or manifest that Islam is the religion of truth. And the Quran's 19 base system explains how that would happen. And just one final note about these two false verses. You, the preservation of the Quran does not mean that, let's say you write down something false when making a copy of the Quran. It does not mean that God will magically chop off your hand or magically erase the falsehood from the physical copies. The original written copy of the Quran is with God. It is in the preserved tablet or the Lawhil Mahfuz in Arabic. And the man-made copies that we have today are not the original copies. They are the copies of the original copy of the Quran that is sitting with God right now. And the 19-base system is the tool that Muslims should use to make sure that our copies are as similar to that original copy as possible. This is how we make sure the Quran remains preserved and intact. This is how we make sure that falsehood can never enter the Quran, because the falsehood can never enter it when we use the 19-base system to filter out any falsehoods from the Quran. So this is the end of this presentation, and I'm gonna make a third video because this series, Basics of Islam, is a three-part series. And part three will talk about another very important topic. And as always, peace and blessings be upon you, and I hope you have an amazing and wonderful day and amazing and wonderful rest of your lives, to be honest. And see you in the next video, God willing, inshallah. Bye.